Okay, and we are recording, and welcome.
Great. Super.
Okay.
All set, Sue?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hi, Sue, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this evening. I'm Jennifer Smith Turner, and here to talk about my debut novel, Child Bride. I'm going to assume that most have not read the book yet, but if you could, in the chat room, if you have, just note that so I get a sense of um, how many people have already looked and read in the book, and that'll help with some of the discussion as we go forward. But what I thought I would do is just give you some background of the story, when and how this came to fruition, and how it's been accepted. I've been so pleased when you have a debut novel. You know, you write and you write, and I'm primarily a poet and have several books of poetry that I've published. And you put something out into the world, and you have no idea how it's going to be received. And so it's been wonderful to see how this story and Nell's story, who is the protagonist, the main character for those who know the story, how her story has been received. So that's been wonderful to see. So I see a couple of people chimed in that they've read the book. So this is my first novel. It was published in April of this year, right in the middle of the pandemic. And my first reaction was, oh, great. So there's no way I'm going to be able to do anything in any book tours or any signings or anything because we're in a pandemic. And then suddenly I learned about this thing called Zoom that we're on right now, which in March I knew nothing about. And now I live on this between book work and between my boards and like the rest of us, you know, this is how we all sort of communicate and socialize just through Zoom. So thank goodness for Zoom. I think we all need to make sure we buy some stock in it because they have to be doing extremely well, quite frankly. But that was the good news. That was a surprising thing. The other side of a difficult situation is that the reach because of Zoom has been tremendous. And so book clubs have picked up my book from all over the country, and even from some European countries have picked it up. And I've been on Zoom calls with these groups, which is so amazing. Could never do that, but for everyone doing things virtually. So Child Bride is about Nell is the main character's name. It's a coming of age story. She grows up in the segregated South, born in the 40s, married off very young when she's 16, and becomes part of the great migration that goes to the North. And she ends up in Boston. And the story unfolds that whole trajectory of what happens to her and how she comes to be a young woman, because she's very young when she starts out. And when she ends, she's probably in her 20s, I think, when the story concludes, and what she experiences over that period of time. When I was working on the book, as I've mentioned, I'm a poet and have always been a poet. And I was working with an editor, and I was struggling with going from poetry to fiction. One of the biggest changes is simply length. It's long. It takes a long time to write a story and to keep with it and keep the action going in a novel. And with the poetry, it's pretty concise. It's at least the type of poetry that I write. And you can get through it, and even though you're always editing. So I struggled for a bit, and I thought that I needed to put my poetry aside and to find a different way of writing because it was a novel. And I was working with an editor, and he gave me some of the most important advice that I got through that process. He said, and he knew my poetry, and that's how we had first come to know each other, through a workshop that we had gone to. And he said, Jennifer, you need to let your poetic voice into your writing. He said, it's like you've pushed it aside. And that's your voice. Let that writing, let that poetry come into your writing, even though you're not writing poetry per se. And oh my goodness, it was sort of like whenever you get permission to do something, how it can open and you see, stars and sparkles. And that's what happened for me. And it really helped my writing tremendously. And so the whole notion of making sure that all of your senses is what you do in poetry. Is when you write poetry, you're really just creating for the reader that moment where they can experience whatever the emotion is, whatever the senses is, what you're smelling, what you're seeing. And that's what you do with a poem. And so once I realized I need to do that exact same thing in my novel writing, then it took off. and I worked really hard at letting that poetry and that imagery come alive in the writing. I hope I succeeded at that. Readers can tell me, but some of the feedback suggests that people feel like they are there, that they can smell the kitchen, they can smell the biscuits that are being made. And when people give me that feedback, it's like, okay, it actually works. So that was just a wonderful feedback to get. The other thing I'll share with you is the cover of the book. As I said, this was a debut novel. I'm going to hold up a photograph here and see if everyone can see it. Yeah, there we go. It's a black and white photograph of the cover of the book. So that cover photograph is actually of my mother when she was 18 years old, holding my oldest brother, circa about 1947. And that's at Jamaica Pond in Boston. And when the publisher was sending me cover designs after we had gone through all the finishing touches of editorial work on the book, I kept looking at the designs they were giving me, and I had this black and white photo on my desk, and it was an aunt who had given it to me years ago. You know how sometimes relatives will send you pictures. Of course, I didn't know my mother at that age, so it was so wonderful to see that picture of her and my oldest brother at that age. And I said to the publisher, I think I have a photograph that would just be perfect on the cover. And I could almost hear them groaning through the internet saying, oh yeah, a debut novelist, she thinks she can design a cover, right? Let us do it, we're experts. I said, well, just let me send it to you. And I told her the story. And they looked at it and they said, oh my goodness, that's the cover. And so they colorized it and sort of changed it some, but that became the cover of the book. Now, it's important to me on a number of levels. One, because it's my mother and my brother, so it sort of tickles me to see them on this debut novel and have so many people who were touching this and reading this. But she was also the person who was my biggest supporter. And so I come from a long corporate career. I worked in the government and I worked in corporations. And, for 30 years, whenever I would get a promotion, and I would tell her what I was doing, and she would always say, I'm so proud of you, Jen, but you're a good writer. And that's what she would say to me for 30 years. And it wasn't until she passed away in 2000 that I actually heard what she was telling me. And that's when I said, oh my goodness, I think she was trying to tell me maybe I should write. And that's when I started to focus on writing. And so to have her on the cover of this first book, I feel like, she's watching, because I always feel like mothers are watching, even when they're long gone, that she's watching and she's saying, I told you so, Jennifer. I told you so, you're a good writer. So it really warms my heart to know that she's on the cover of this. Is a lot of fun. So what I thought I would do is read a little bit and then talk some more. And for people who have read it, if you have questions, we'll do some questions later as well. I'll read a little bit from the first chapter, and then I'll choose one other section. But this sort of sets the framework for the world that Nell is coming from as she starts out. And so this is chapter 1 of A Child Bride. My childhood farm in Louisiana wasn't much to look at. It stood on a long, dusty road, one of many small hog and pecan farms owned and worked by the descendants of sharecroppers and former slaves. Our house had been built by hand. The wood shingles were uneven, the doors never closed completely, and the window frames were crooked. 90-degree angles didn't find a home in this house. We had a few pictures hanging on the wall right by the front door near a window. One was of my grandparents, my daddy's parents. The image was murky, all dark and grainy, as if the camera needed a better focus on their faces. My grandparents stood shoulder to shoulder in the picture, their bodies framed in an oval cutout. Their eyes looked straight ahead, staring into the camera and at me whenever I was close to the picture. There were no smiles or grins on their faces. It was as though they were angry, unhappy, or tired, weary, like my daddy sometimes looked when he came in from the fields. Grandma's hair was pulled back in a tight bun with a straight part down the middle of her head. Grandpa had hair all over his face, a thick mustache and long beard that looked rugged and wiry, like the steel wool in the kitchen Mama used to clean pots and pans. My daddy looked a lot like his daddy. Every time Daddy walked past their picture, he'd give the frame a little nudge to straighten it, but it never seemed to work. If the frame was parallel to the door frame, it was crooked to the window casing. And when it lined up at the angle of the window, it was lopsided to the door frame. The few times the picture actually looked straight, with my grandparents' eyes level with my daddy's eyes, both the door and window seemed to slope to one side. I took to just tilting my head left or right to look at the picture. Seemed to be easier. But Daddy always touched the frame. We didn't have a picture of my mama's parents on the wall. She kept their picture in the drawer of the nightstand by the bed. Sometimes I'd see her holding the picture, stroking the glass on the frame. I asked her once why her parents' picture wasn't on the wall. She looked sad and said, "I like to have them close to me at night." The sweeping front porch was the best part of the house. There we'd spend hot evenings waiting for the slightest breeze to move the heavy Louisiana air in hopes of a moment of coolness. We children would grab our pillows and sheets, lay our bodies on the porch for the night, giggle and tease one another. Stretched out on our backs, hands behind our heads, faces turned to the heavens, we count the stars and hope to see the tail of a shooting star make its way across the sky. One time, Robert, the oldest, stayed a while with us and explained the different star formations. "See that over there? That's the North Star. It's the brightest star in the sky." He pointed up, and our eyes followed the angle of his finger. "If you start at the North Star, you can outline the Little Dipper. The North Star is the tip of the handle. See there, the brightest star? And the ladle part is connected, like the ladle we use to scoop water at the well." "Robert," I asked, "how do you know about stars in the sky?" He lay still for a moment, his head tilted all the way back, as if he were letting sunshine soak into his skin. Once he said, "I dreamed I'd learned everything about the sky and stars, how it all came to be, what the proper names are for each star and planet. I wanted to be a learned man, no more than just farm and fields knowing, but schooling wasn't meant for me, or me for it." He fell silent again, rubbed his forehead and went inside, leaving us, the little ones, to guess at the stars' names for ourselves. The crickets and cicadas provided background sound to our astral explorations, and then the fireflies began their light dance, bringing the stars even closer to us. We reveled in our sanctuary until the mosquitoes and flies forced us all back inside. The other family gathering place was the kitchen. Food was cleaned, prepared, eaten, and stored there. It was the largest room of the house, the place where my mama spent most of her time. Mama taught me how to measure seasonings at the kitchen counter that my daddy and brothers had built. "Just a pinch of salt, soon you know what a pinch feels like," she'd say. I watched her pinch seasonings from the palm of her hand, her fingertips becoming measuring tools. One day, Mama told me to make the best breakfast biscuits by myself. "I can help if you need me," she said. I got the ingredients from the food cabinet and icebox: flour, baking soda, yeast, sugar, salt, eggs, butter, and milk. I arranged everything on the counter, placed the mixing bowl in the center, and grabbed the tools I needed to make biscuits. I looked at Mama. "Do I have it right so far?" She nodded her head and went about making the breakfast meat and eggs. I folded the dry stuff together just the way Mama had shown me. Then I added the eggs, butter, and liquids and stirred using a fork. Dough started to form. I thought the mixture was ready to be pressed into lumps and go onto the baking sheet. "Is this ready, Mama?" "You the cook, you decide," she said as she turned the bacon over. But just as I was about to put the first mound of dough on the baking sheet, Mama coughed and said, "Best to grease the sheet. That way the biscuits won't stick to the pan. It's also good to put food in a hot oven." I took a stick of butter and ran it across the baking sheet, leaving thick clumps everywhere. The matches for the oven were sitting on the counter next to Mama. She stepped aside so I could get them and open the oven door. The only other time I'd lit the oven, Mama had let me strike the match, but she'd put it in the pilot light to start the flame while I worked the oven dial. I looked up at her now to see she was going to help, but she didn't turn my way. I tried to strike the match, but nothing happened. I tried again. Nothing. On my next try, the match lit and broke at the same time, causing a flame to fall to the floor. I jumped back and stomped my foot on the tiny fire. "Mama, I need help," I cried out to her. "A cook got to know how to strike a match and light an oven. Try again." This time, the match lit on the first strike. I placed it in the opening for the oven and turned the temperature dial as far as it would go to the right. To my young eyes, it seemed as though I was responsible for starting a bonfire with the blue and white tip flames dancing in the wind. I stepped back, closed the oven door. Mama slid to her spot in front of the stove. I was able to cut the dough into 20 biscuits. Some were smaller than others and some looked a little funny, but there was more than enough for everyone. "Mama, I'm ready to put this in the oven. Don't they look good?" I tilted the baking sheet so Mama could admire my work. "Is the oven at the right temperature?" she responded as she examined the collection of dough. "Well, what's the right temperature?" I asked. "The temperature that will cook the biscuits without burning them or leaving the dough in the middle uncooked." "How am I supposed to know, Mama?" "Baby girl, you've been watching me make biscuits every morning since you could walk and talk on your own. You've seen how I work the oven. What have you learned?" Mama turned the dial to the left, making a half circle of the full circle I'd made earlier. "This is the correct setting. At the very top where you put the dial is the hottest. You can roast a pig at that setting. Too hot for biscuits. Now you have to wait and let it cool down before you put the biscuits in, or they'll just burn." That morning, Daddy, my brother Robert, his wife Bernice, and two of my middle brothers would eat first. The men had been working the farm since sunrise, as they did most every day, except Sunday, when we all went to church to celebrate and thank the Lord for our blessings. The men took turns in the fields, then came to eat in shifts before heading back out to the fields until dinner time. I was happy that Daddy was going to have my biscuits when I took them straight out of the oven, still hot and moist, the butter melted and dripping. The men on the next shift would have cold biscuits, whatever was left in the first group who had already eaten. I watched everyone take their seats at the table. Daddy sat at the head, facing the door to face the porch. Mama sat at his right. My brother Robert sat at the other end, facing Daddy. And Bernice sat to Robert's right. Everyone else filled in wherever there was an empty chair. I wanted to push the biscuits directly in front of Daddy, but Mama had a certain spot for each food platter on the table. The breakfast meats, bacon, sausage, and ham hocks were placed closest to Daddy. The scrambled eggs came next, then the biscuits. Pancakes and hot oatmeal followed, along with the seasonings: salt, pepper, maple syrup, and sugar. Jugs of milk, orange juice, and water filled in the corners of the table. Daddy blessed the food. I kept one eye open for his blessing. "Baby girl made these biscuits all by herself," Mama announced after the blessings were said and Daddy started to fill his plate. "I think I'll start with a biscuit." Daddy reached for the biscuit plate. I helped, holding the platter out to him. "Start there too," Robert chimed in. "Pass those down here." The platter was passed down the table and everyone took a biscuit. I watched as Daddy brought the biscuit to his lips. He took a big bite. Suddenly he stopped. He looked over at Mama. She took a small bite from her biscuit. She stopped too. Robert put his down on his plate and began drinking water. The younger brothers screamed. They looked as if they wanted to spit the food on the floor. "Don't you dare spit at the table," Mama scolded as she grabbed the glass of water. Daddy had already finished drinking his water and was pouring himself more. Bernice nibbled at her biscuit and said, "I think I'll have some water too." No one looked at me. I grabbed a biscuit and took a big bite. My mouth began to sting in the corners by my jaw. I wanted to spit out the biscuit, but I took a big swallow, acting as though I actually liked what I was eating. But all I could taste was salt. It was as if I had held the salt shaker up to my mouth and poured salt onto my tongue. I gulped down my water and rubbed tears from the corner of my eyes. When we were cleaning up, Mama asked, "Baby girl, did you taste your food while you were cooking?" "Mama, you knew I made a mistake. Why didn't you say something?" The only way to learn is from mistakes. Close your eyes and hold out your hand. Mama poured something into my hand. "Now take your other hand and gently rub your fingers over this. Make small circles in your palm." I did as she told me, slowly rubbing the stuff. "What does it feel like?" she asked. Soft but gritty, I said. Does it have a smell? I held my palm up to my nose. Not that I can tell. Now wipe your hand clean, and I'm going to put something else in your palm. She poured something into my hand again. Now rub this the same way with your fingers. Does this feel different? It's softer, not as gritty. Does this have a smell? I've tried again, but still didn't smell anything. But does it feel different? She asked. Yes. Now open your eyes. The salt and sugar containers were sitting on the table in front of me. The containers looked exactly the same. Silver tins with tops that had to be twisted off. I'd struggled to open one of the tins when I was making the biscuits. I remembered I'd put it down to get something to pry it open with. The salt went in the mixture first, then sugar, but that was the tin I'd struggled with. The tins were next to each other. A cook needs to understand the feel of ingredients, Mama said. Touch is everything to good cooking. But the salt and sugar don't feel that different, Mama. Wouldn't it be easier to just use different looking containers? Baby girl, you sassing me. I'm sorry, Mama. Guess I should throw these out before the others come in for breakfast. I reach for the biscuits to toss them into the trash. You'll do no such thing. We don't waste food here. But they're terrible. Time for another lesson. Get the butter, milk, a bowl, and the sugar. I scurried around collecting the items and placed them all on the counter. The oven is still warm, she said. Put the butter in so it'll be soft enough to mix. Put the sugar in the bowl. Don't be shy, use a lot, at least a full cup. I measured out a cup and dumped it into the bowl. Pour the milk in and then add the butter. It should be soft now. And then fold the butter into the milk and sugar. I worked the soft butter into the milk and sugar, pressing the fork down with each turn of my hand. Keep adding milk until the mixture is smooth so it can be spread on the biscuits. And taste it as you go. Make sure it's very sweet. Add more sugar if you need to. Mama began to arrange the biscuits on the baking dish. Baby girl used the basting brush and spread the sugar mix on each biscuit. We'll put the biscuits back in the oven and let them stay warm for the next breakfast seating. But sprinkle some sugar on top just to be sure. Too sweet is never a problem. So that's the opening scene of, thank you, of Nell with her mama cooking on her own for the first time. And so much of in the book and the storyline is about how Nell learns and how she has the different experiences. And there's always someone different teaching her. A number of themes that are prevalent for me or very important for me in the book is one, family, and that comes across very early on, and you'll see throughout the entire book that importance of family in her life, even when she leaves the area and she's living, in Boston, it is still family that she relies on for her strength. And then that there's all different definitions of family. And then there are the relationships of women, which is the other theme that's in the book, how women support each other, look out for each other. When she moves to Boston, she's in this very, very constrained relationship because Henry has become this controlling person, which she did not know he would. And suddenly she's confined to this apartment, this one-room apartment, and she's not able to leave it. And he really just isolates her terribly. But she gets out eventually and she meets women in a beauty salon and they become her new family. And they just take one look at her and they just know, oh my goodness, this little girl needs some help. And they embrace her and they look out for her, and it becomes a group of people that she relies on a great deal and a big piece of her life. And then finally, she's been isolated from church. While it was very much a big part of her life when she was at home in the South, it is a big part of Henry's life, and that's her husband's name that she marries. But he, again, because he's into isolating her, doesn't let her go to church with him when they were in Boston. And so she doesn't even have that social structure where she has missed all this time. Finally, she goes, and finally she gets back into church. And then the church women become another group of women who embrace her and take care of her right from just getting her ready so that she's a mess. The first day she goes to church, she wasn't prepared for it, wasn't dressed pretty or anything. And they work with her and they take care of her. So the theme of family, the theme of strong relationships between women. And then the other theme is really the inner strength that Nell has and how she is over time able to summon that up. There are times when she's so vulnerable because she is so young and she's being treated so poorly by her husband. But she finds an inner strength, and then she has her sexuality is pretty prominent in this book as well, and that comes out of all places in the church. I won't go into details with those who haven't read it. You need to read it, but that's a big part of who she is. She's a very young girl in this. She who is becoming a woman, and so her own internal power and strength comes out in so many ways throughout her journey that it was fun to write, and it was fun to watch this character evolve over time throughout the story. Number of things that I learned in writing. I took a lot of writing courses before I started this adventure and this journey, and talked to a lot of novelists who were very seasoned novelists. And one thing they all told me was that there is a point in time where your characters take on a life of their own, and you are not so much creating them as you were simply the scribe who was supposed to tell their story. And that actually was true. I was so surprised to have that happen, that there were periods of time when I would have writer's block where I was just nothing would happen, and I could go as long as 6 months and not write anything in this novel. I would write other things, but nothing was happening. And I was thinking, okay, well, this, that was it. It was exercise. It's not going to go anywhere. And in the middle of the night, I would wake up because there would be Nell banging on my head, inside my head, telling me, this is what happens. You need to write this. And I would get up and I would start writing, and there she would be, and then the story would take off again. So it was a remarkable experience to know that at some point, I liken it to, if you remember as kids using Ouija boards, you put your fingers on the Ouija board and the boards are moving themselves, and you're never sure, am I moving that or is it really moving itself? And that's how I felt with the characters. I was never sure, am I actually writing the story, or are they just telling me what to write? But they really did come alive in a big way for me. So it was a great exercise to go through. So now one of my big challenges is to think about, do I write a sequel? And for those who have read it, I would ask that question of you to put a note in the chat room. I've been asking everyone I've been meeting with, or is it simply enough? Is the book enough where it is? And I know I will write another novel of some kind, whether it's a sequel to this or something else. But I'm curious to get people's reaction to that thought as well. So that's what it takes you to, and I'll stop here to see if there are any questions or that people have, or anything in the chat room that I can respond to.
Oh, okay. Someone asked, what brought you to Nell in this story specifically?
Great question. This is actually the second novel that I've written, although it's the first one that's ever gone anywhere. And the first novel that I wrote, which was probably this wonderful first draft, was in the late 1998 or early 2000s. And, I finished it. It's, 300 pages of a manuscript. I was feeling very good about it. And I started to send it out to people to read, and it was both publishers as well as some agents, and I got very negative feedback. It's just, no, it wasn't any good. So I said, okay, so maybe I'm not meant to write this. But to a person, what they all said to me that there was one character that they found very intriguing, and that character was a very minor character. And this particular novel was more contemporary. The storyline happens in the 70s and the 80s, and it's about young adults in their 20s and 30s who are the main characters, and the mother of one of the group of children, whose name was Mother Claire. And that was the character that everyone said, but she was interesting, and I think I'd like to know more about her. So years later, when I'm thinking, well, maybe I'll try my hand at writing again, that character came to mind. And I thought, well, gee, maybe there's something to that. Well, fast forward to my life now, and Mother Claire morphed into Nell. And so when I was writing Nell, it was actually the story of the older woman that I had written about the first time, who was a minor character, who now is the younger woman who's 14 years old when she's sort of introduced into the world. And that's where it started. So in my mind's eye, I could see the older person. I could see the woman in her 40s and her 50s, even as I'm writing the story of Nell, even though I had not created that backstory for her in the first novel. But when I started, when it clicked with me that I should focus on her, then I went to her youth, had her start in the South, and then move her way back into Boston, which is where the first novel actually opened up. It starts in Boston. So that was sort of the connection. And then where it was going to go from there, I just had no idea. It would just evolve as I would work with each chapter, in which each piece that was going on. The two anchors for me that were real places where I do have a family farm. My father grew up in Louisiana, so that is a real thing. And then I grew up in Boston, so Boston is a real place for me. And as I mentioned before, this photograph on the cover was taken in Boston. So that's where Nell came from. And because of that, what the editor explained to me, and again, it was intuitive, I didn't realize it was happening, but my point of view for this was first person retrospective, because I had the picture and the image of the older person in my mind, and I'm writing about her when she's younger. It's sort of like you're sitting on a stoop and your aunt or your grandparent is telling you, when I was 14, here's what happened back home, and here's how we did things. And it's sort of that perspective that goes on. So, but great question, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, another question. What kind of research did you do to bring up that time period in Boston and make that come to life?
A lot of research, and I guess we're so lucky that we have, the internet to
Mhm.
just to go into. The other thing I have is I have this huge book that I got years ago, and it shows the New York Times, and it's all of the headlines of the New York Times that covers about 2 or 3 decades, which is a fascinating thing to have. So
Oh, wow.
in terms of what's happening in the world, I can go into that and look at, well, what was happening in 1925 and what was in New York on the cover of the New York Times, and that became very helpful as place. But a lot of it is just research on the internet, and so I would research again, looking at what's happening in terms of newspapers at that period of time, looking what buildings were like, even for the South, when I'm describing some of the buildings and the store, the shop that she goes to for provisions with her dad. It is going on the internet and looking at images of the segregated South of that period of time and what did it look like, and then writing that, capturing that photograph and creating that and making it part of the scene. So a lot of research that way.
Yeah, someone asked, what was the history of the child bride culture and how did the young girls deal with this?
Oh yeah, that was very real. I mean, even my own family. My grandmother was extremely young when my father was born, as we know from family story. That it was the culture is what you accepted. Part of what you hear in her mother's voice and mama's voice is, one, she accepts that she had the exact same experience that Nell and all the other women in the household are having. They're all married off young. The one exception to that, and the characters in this book, is Miss Parker, who is the unmarried school teacher in the one-room schoolroom that they go to. And Miss Parker is a huge role model for Nell because she is so different and she's living this independent life and she didn't get married off young, and all those things are very different, and she's so educated. But Nell rails against that model. She does not want to be what she saw her mother and all the other women. But in fact, that's exactly what she becomes because she has no control over it. And it's through that she's always fighting the reality of the world that I'm forced into because I am a woman, and because you're just supposed to do these things, get out of the house and be married as soon as possible and have lots of children. And of course, the lots of children piece, I think for most cultures then came from the fact that you were on farms and you actually needed a lot of people to manage the farms. And also childbirth rates weren't great, was the other issue that was happening for people at that time. So it was hard. She was fighting against that. And most of the storyline really comes from her belief that I shouldn't have to live that way. I shouldn't have to have that experience, even while she's having the experience, which is the conflict that she's dealing with all the time.
Yeah. Now, tell me again, does this book go way into the future, or is it just mostly from one period of time?
Yeah, it actually, you're in the 60s when the book ends. So we're right at the cusp of the civil rights movement, which is why in my mind that if I do write a piece of that, there's a lot that could happen as the story ends, and what her role and how she might be impacted in her family by the civil rights era that's about to
Yeah.
emerge at that time.
Have you ever thought about turning it into a screenplay or?
A lot of people have asked that, and people who have read it and say it would be wonderful. I actually have somebody looking at it now to possibly see if there's a way. I guess that's a whole process. I mean, if anyone has leads, let me know. That'd be great. But what I'm told is you have to be willing to option it, get an agent who will option it, and shop it to studios to see if they find it of interest to turn it into a screenplay. But that would be great fun. I would love for that to happen.
Yeah.
But, it could be cool.
Okay, does anybody have any other questions? I'll take a break. And by the way, if you don't want to use the chat, you could just unmute yourself and talk at this point. You don't have to be that formal.
Yes. Cindy, it looks like you have
Hi.
Hi, Cindy.
Your book was amazing. I felt like I was wrapped in a warm blanket reading about the family and the mom and the culture. It was just absolutely amazing. I also heard I guess the ebb and flow of the chapters with your poetry. I mean, there was definitely a way that each chapter kind of came alive and had something important to say, and then led to the next chapter, and I couldn't put it down. It was absolutely beautiful. One of my questions was with Henry. I was so surprised at his change in character, because he seemed to be a different person when he was in Louisiana and courting her and went along with all that, and then to change to this controlling, really horrific person. And I was wondering how that happened. I was just
I know. Well, Henry is a real enigma to everyone. And I will tell you that my husband is my first reader for everything that I read. And he would read chapters on Henry, and I hate him. I
know.
Just really hated him. But, it evolved that way. And I think and I wasn't planning that out. I mean, literally, just evolved as I was going along. But what struck me about him is that he had, if you remember him in Louisiana, he had such these big dreams about what he could accomplish and what he could do. And the North was his answer to everything. And I think the reality with Henry is that he was just so out of his league. And he marries someone, even though she's very young, she's very intelligent. She's very educated, and she loves education. He was none of those things.
Right.
So now he finds himself in the North. He realizes he cannot live up to anything he's boasted about being able to do. And he's with this woman who could, in fact, probably do most of what he thinks he would like to do, because she's capable and competent. And what does he do? He just says, he said, well, the one thing I can do is I can control her. And so that was his power, and that was the only thing that he had going for him when he realized that she was really just probably out of his league, and that he was never going to be who he thought he was going to be. And he just turns into this terrible person. So you almost, at some degree, you feel badly for him, because I think he's a very complex character. He's also just not a nice person at all.
Right. He works hard. He works hard. He wants to support his family. He knows he wants to do the right thing, I think, but he just doesn't know how to. So.
He just doesn't know how to. And so isolating her becomes the greatest way. And he was able to be successful with that because she was so young. I think that's where her youngness really played into it. And isolation is one of the first things and the worst things an abuser does, because when you're isolated, and to be that young, you're at their mercy. And that's what he did to her.
And my other question was, I was surprised it took so long for Nell to find the church. It seemed like that would have been her first thing because it was so important. I kept saying, what about the church? And it just took a while for it, I thought.
It did. And it partly, again, that was intentional on his part, because he knew that would give her an outlet, and it would give her a world, which is exactly, of course, what happened. And of course, ironic that when she gets there, that's where she finds this other man. So, everything he was afraid of happened in the church, essentially. But that was right. But I think you're right. For her desire, and it really was when she went back and saw her mom, and she said, wait a minute, I'm letting you do this stuff to me. I can't let you do this any longer. I need my church. I need to be around people and have that back in my life. But he was really working that against her.
I think you're right. Yeah. Well, of course you're right. And I think
learned, I'll tell you, every time I listen to these scripts, I love it, because there are things, people pick up things that I had not thought about.
Oh my God.
So really, I learn a lot. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It was wonderful. And the relationship with Nell and her lover. And, at first I was appalled. I'm like, oh my God, but then the more it developed, it was like, they're like soulmates, and it developed like that, so it it was, at first I was like going to throw the book. I'm like saying, don't even go there. What are you thinking? But as it got going, you know, I got it and it was beautiful. And, you know, thank you for this book. It was just heartwarming.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm glad it touched you. I really am.
So much. So
Thank
much.
you.
Oh, I have one more. Someone asked if you have a book of poetry, which, so I know that you do. And I was
I
going to ask
do.
you what they are.
Yeah, I have two books of poetry that have been published. I belong to a poetry group here on the island called the Cleveland House Poets, and we meet every other Wednesday all year round, which is a wonderful group to be a part of. And we've published some collections of our own work. But the beauty of that group is that it keeps you fresh, and because it's a workshop, so that we bring a new poem to the group every time that we're meeting, so that we're always sharing and then workshopping each other's work. And I'm looking to see, because I might, if I have something close at hand, I might share one, because we've been doing a lot, obviously because of the pandemic, we've been doing a lot of work that has to do with the pandemic. And I've also did some work. We have a charter school here on the island. And of course, everyone had been, you know, the kids weren't going to school, and they started to do a hybrid model, but they wanted to have some experience for the high school students that was not computer-based in front of a screen. And so they had some events held around the island and asked people to come in. And so I went in on Wednesdays for the month of October and worked with the high school students around writing, and just to get them, you know, out, and we would meet outside and, you know, on the lawn and that sort of thing. And so I would give them writing prompts, and I'll share one with you, and then they would write. And it's great, because I find that particularly students love poetry. It's a great way for them to express themselves. But this particular prompt was, I can see your eyes, because we were talking about COVID and the impact, and then we're all sitting there with our masks on, and how you don't know what anybody looks like. And I'll never recognize any of them if I see them someplace else again because of the mask. So the prompt was, I can only see your eyes. And so everyone wrote, and this is the piece that I wrote that came out of that. Before, I can only see your eyes. Before, your entire face was important to gain understanding of your pain, anger, happiness, sadness. Before, a mask was a hiding place where anonymity lived, fear festered, the unknown cowered. Before, I never truly saw you. But now in your eyes, I can hear a smile, see a song, a shout, boredom, engagement, the need for quiet. Now my eyes see you in your eyes. And it was because we were focused on the notion that you have to pay so much more attention to people when you lose all the other facial expressions around them, and how often we're with people and we don't look deeply in other people's eyes. So that is, that's one of the things we did with the kids, which is fun to do.
Oh, I just looked. So we have two of your poetry books at Clams, and I just typed them into the chat. Lost and Found, Rhyming Verse, and Perennial Secrets.
Yes.
Or both.
And that was the first one, Perennial Secrets, Poetry and Prose. I think that was about 2003 that one came out, and the other one 2006.
Yeah, so those are both available, and you're working on another one, right?
I am. Another book of poems. In fact, I have all the poems gathered for them, but it's just a question of organizing it and going through all the edits. So that'll be a good winter project for me to work on as we continue in our whatever stage we are in lockdown and quarantine these days. So yes.
Oh, and someone said congratulations on your debut novel. I'm looking forward to reading it and recommending it to my book group.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. And as I say, I am meeting with book groups. So if you do have that interest, just go to my website, and if the scheduling works, and I spend time with the book groups, and that's always a lot of fun to do that as well.
Oh yeah, sure. It's good to know. Okay, any other questions, or either in the chat, or does anyone want to speak? Excuse.
I want to know about yeast biscuits. I've only made biscuits with butter and buttermilk and egg. What's that about? I've never...
I know, right? So again, a combination of things. So I had to talk to my sister about that, because we always have biscuits in the house. And so between research, and I talked to my sister, I said, what was it? Because again, we never, who does recipes? You know, your family gets in the kitchen, your mother cooks what she cooks and what we had known. And she said, oh no, yeah, because we always had them in there. I said, okay, and that's what I'm putting in there. But then I did research it as well to say, okay, are there recipes like this? And I did find them. There are recipes like that. But that's how my mom made her biscuits. So that's great. It was a family thing.
Yeah, it sounds great.
I guess I have one more question. I'm sorry. You mentioned about doing a sequel to this, and I think I would love to hear a sequel to this about Nell. But I'm also wondering if maybe a sequel from the point of view of one of her children might be interesting, and where they go from here.
Right.
You know, I mean, she's got these incredible kids that she's raised as a young mom, and kind of what their perspective is and where they might go from there. Just a thought.
No, that's a great, because if you think about it, as I shared with you where she came from, the original character, it was in fact about the children, that first novel. I mean, so it's really kind of ironic to now, maybe that's why I haven't thrown the manuscript away, that there may be pieces in there that I'm going to use, I don't know. The other thing that's interesting about the children is simply, you know, so we know what happens between Henry and the children. But at some point, particularly Junior, who's the older child, and so he knows Henry the best, will say, where's my father? And so there's a whole nother potential there of, you know, does he come back into their lives, and what does that look like? And what's the anger between father and, you know, all those kinds of things, because he abandons them basically.
Right.
So
and Charles's mother, okay, she's like the hero. She's amazing, and her input with the kids and all that, it was just, you know, heartwarming.
Yeah, she was very special, and that, to my point of their family being such a strong theme, but it's in all permutations, because that's a different kind of family. But it was definitely family though for her. Yeah, she was a special lady.
I'm a teacher here in East Falmouth. I just retired, but we have so many families that this reminded me of the generations and the caring for each other, and it's just an amazing book. And thank you so much for writing it. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That was great. Super. Wonderful.
Okay, unless we have another question, I guess we will wrap it up.
Well, thank you, everyone. Those who have read it, thank you for the feedback. It's wonderful. It's great to spend time with you. And Sue, thanks for pulling this together. And,
you're welcome.
It's really, and one day, hopefully, we can do things in person and actually go into the library and do a signing, and all that kind of stuff would be fun.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Okay, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, and have a great night. And I will send the video link as soon as we have it up.
Thanks, everybody.
Send it to you too.
Happy holidays too. Take care.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.